All right, recording. Welcome to our podcast. I'm Michael.
And I'm Jim.
This podcast is called Rising Above Trauma, Addiction, and Culture in a Crazy World. In this podcast, we will discuss personal experiences with trauma and what we've done and are doing to try and overcome its lasting negative effects. We will refer to a book titled Freedom and Dysfunction in an All-American Family, which is about Jim's experience of abuse and neglect and his descent into multiple addictions. The podcast will range from the nitty-gritty of experienced violence and deprivation to more intellectual discussions of a writer's choice to fictionalize trauma accounts to better convey the spirit of the experience. American culture will also play a role in terms of its ability to both add to and address the problems of abuse and neglect in American families. We are both in 12-step recovery, so we will also share experience, strength, and hope around what we've done to overcome our dysfunctional youth. All right, this is our first episode. We are titling it Truth and Trauma. The word truth, people listening can't hear it, but we've got it in quotes because we imagine that there is more than one way to get at the truth. We'll be reading a scene called The Shining from Jim's book. It actually opens Jim's book. Jim will discuss why he chose to write a semi-fictional opening to his trauma memoir. I will give my take on Tim O'Brien's nonfiction memoir, which is called If I Die in a Combat Zone, in addition to the much more well-known fictional memoir, The Things They Carried, and discuss the concept of story truth as opposed to happening truth. Jim and I will go on to explore the concept of getting an emotional truth in a memoir. Finally, time permitting, we will explore trauma's impact on memory. This is a half-hour podcast, so if we run out of time, we will include the rest in episode 2. All right, let's get to it. Welcome, Jim.
Hi, thanks.
All right, Jim. So let's start off with, can you read The Shining for us? Read and first of all, before we actually get into that, I'd like to ask why you chose to title this section The Shining.
It's an allusion to the movie The Shining with Jack Nicholson. And I just wanted to create a sense of how barbaric it was to live in that household at times. And I thought that might give the reader a little feel for it.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to listening.
Okay. So this is about 3 pages, so bear with us. Again, the title is The Shining Experience. And I put Shining in quotes, and it's from 1973. Just a tablespoon of this medicine and you'll be fine, my mom pleads. I'm laying in a single bed in my upstairs bedroom on my first night of real terror. Mercifully, I don't know what is to come. They say ignorance is bliss, and from my experience, this is an understatement. So, propped up against the soft pillow, I take the syrupy grape medication, which is supposed to ease my strep throat. Mom murmurs, "Good job, Jimmy. You'll feel better soon." That is the last thing I hear before I fall into a deep sleep, which lasts a few hours until about midnight, when I am awakened by a crashing sound and then a muted thud like a body falling hard onto our 1970s bright green shag carpet. I am still a little woozy, but I know something is up, so I crawl out of bed. I'm in my red and white polka-dotted pajamas, from head to toe, snug and warm. But the unaware body can be comfortable while the brain fills with cortisol and adrenaline. I walk to my bedroom door, my hands slightly shaking, my heart pounding in my ears. The silence in the house is deafening. I know something is terribly wrong, and I don't want to be blindsided by a terrorist. In this household, over the next 4 years, my father will make Osama bin Laden seem like a bumbling Santa Claus, because on 911, bin Laden was so far away from my reality He was no threat at all, not like the danger that my daddy represented during my early teenage years. Is he downstairs? Why is it so quiet? Even as an innocent boy of 12, I know I can't just stay in this room with no escape routes. I have to act. Every bone in my body says freeze, don't move, don't fight, don't run. I learned this lesson well in those years of terror. I shake my head and pinch my arm to try to break myself out of this fear trance, and I slowly, quietly crack open my door and peer into the hallway. Nothing there and still no sound. Wide awake, I decide to at least attempt to get out of my room. Or maybe I should climb out of my window under the patio roof and off to safety down the embankment and into the trees. But what about the thud? It could be my mom. I could smell her sweet perfume mixed with alcohol. I can't leave her without at least trying to help to see if she's okay. So I turn back toward the hallway, away from the safety of the bathroom where I could hide, locking it for some modicum of safety. But the mustard seed of courage remains, moving me to investigate. Still no sound in the house as I slowly descend the stairs. I know these stairs by heart. The third one down creaks and will give me away if he is near. And the first landing also creaks, but you can avoid the creak if you step right near the far side nearest the wall. I slowly, expertly make my way down the stairs until I reach the bottom, where I see my mom sprawled out at the foot of the stairs, not moving. It is then that he springs on me. He leaps from behind the wall and reaches out to grab me, but I am too quick for him and make a mad dash up the stairs into the bathroom. I slam the door, lock it, and pull out the vanity drawer to further obstruct its being forced open. The man, the monster, the terrorist arrives at the door and growls. Open the door, son. You don't want to make this any worse than it has to be. What did you do to Mom? Is she okay? Of course. She's just sleeping, he lies. Well, what was that thud I heard? It woke me up. And why would she be sleeping at the foot of the stairs? I sobbed. That was when I can see that he's used something to open the lock and the handle is turning. Leave me alone, I beg. And the door opens, but jams into the open drawer of the vanity. That is when he goes berserk and starts pounding on the door to break the drawer and force entry. But I don't wait to see what happens. In one motion, I turn to the second bathroom window, punch out the screen, and leap out to the embankment below. I get up and run like the wind and keep running. That poor little boy is still running today. And that's the end of that scene with some notes to the reader after.
Well, first, that was very, very exciting. I mean, I know it's not meant to be exciting, it's meant to be terrifying, and it's that too, but which is kind of interesting that, that's something for another time. Our interest in, it's like watching a car crash. It's like one of those things that you shouldn't be watching, but you are.
Yeah,
Um,
and it's
so
that Michael, I know we're going to move on with this, but that does illustrate the challenge of recovery because even though I was terrorized, it was exciting, the adrenaline. And
yes,
that is one of the things that makes it hard to recover from trauma, which is normal life is weird, is boring, flat.
let's. I do want to take some time to talk about that just for a second. That's been, like, as was mentioned, we're both in 12-step recovery. We're both addicts. And, one of the things that, like, for example, I didn't necessarily have, the abuse is not as confrontational, I guess, as what
Violent.
you,
Yeah,
yeah,
physically
violent.
violent.
Thank
Yeah.
you, violent, as what you read. But you know, I have a hard time with the one of the things that my wife says to me is, but okay, that's in the past, right? This is now. Like my life in terms of my in dealing with addiction, this my life now isn't what it was then. But it's like for my body, in almost in ways that I'm not consciously aware of, it's still happening. And so, can you talk a little bit about that kind of that cortisol effect that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think, I mean, being exposed to such a strange world, yours was around food, I realize it, but I don't know, if I'm under eating, there is something. I've been high on diets before where I'm under eating, and there is something about that that's I get more energy. That was part of the Atkins diet. You get more energy, believe it or not. But for me, um, the like when 911 actually happened, I felt like better. And I
We
know some.
feel more alive.
Exactly.
Yes.
And well, I think what it is, some people, especially conservative patriots are like, "Oh my God, how could you think that?" And I get that. And I don't feel good for the people and the real people that were there and all that. But first of all, I'm far away from it, so it's not a real danger to me directly. But the whole country, the whole world is traumatized. And now it's almost like, oh wow, everybody's joining me with my trauma. I feel like
Mm,
we're all together now. We get it. So there's something
yeah.
about that feeling, but I think it stays with you over time.
Well, I've always wondered that, like, why, a normal life, quote unquote, normal life, as in my life now, which is relatively, thankfully, not stressful. Why there is that part of me, though, that still wants to like sabotage my life, blow up my life? Well, because it's exciting.
Exactly. And that's definitely a topic for several more episodes when we get
Yeah.
into the addiction
I,
part.
I
I think
think
there's a
I think we're
lot.
kind of previewing future episodes here. Okay, so getting back to The Shining. So the first question is, what is it true? Did that actually happen?
Some of it did, but I think the best ways to describe that is um, I wanted to make it clear to the reader that it was a very traumatic experience in my house. That the part of being a victim of trauma like that is I won't say for others, but for me, I don't really think other people get it. Like maybe your wife, you're saying, oh, it happened in the past. It's like minimizing it. It's done, whatever. And then, my wife met my dad after he was sober 10 years and he's only been super good to her. you know he had a
Yeah.
spiritual awakening. And so this idea that the boy's trauma is completely forgotten and it's actually stupid, not important. So the
Yeah.
goal in the writing was to make that as clear to the reader as possible that this is real trauma. So back to your question, the simpler answer is this. um, it's an amalgamation of many things that did happen over time. And it is true to the spirit of the house I lived in, starting at about that age.
Yeah. Now, of course, you know, what you've done, I mean, first of all, it's very compelling work, but like for when people read memoir, they they're like memoir is like more so than fiction, because fiction doesn't have this. Fiction is about suspension of disbelief. Memoir is almost can be taken as a contract, right? Like you're contracting with the reader saying, yes, this actually happened. Now, I'm talking about the lay reader. I'm not talking about like, writers who have a different conception of what makes up creative nonfiction. And I'll come back to talk about what that is in a minute. But what a lay reader might say is, why didn't you just write an episode of something that actually happened?
Right. And
And
I wrote several of those episodes in the book, but on this one, as an intro to get the reader's attention, um, it felt like the Shining kind of came out naturally. And I do give and the book is written for me. That's first. It's not
yeah,
written for the reader. And then second, I do give the reader a warning. There's a couple paragraphs after what I read that tells them that this is there are some parts that have been put together from separate instances, but it in no way it in no way does not represent what it was like. And so for me to get at the spirit, I
yeah.
felt like I needed to depart from exact facts. And the exact facts I forget so much except for the worst of the trauma. And it's really hard to put down on paper.
And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, because that what you just said right there, that it's hard to get it down on paper. So I write memoir to write or essay memoir, sometimes book length, and I have struggled for years with being able to try and convey what it felt like. Like, I can write what actually happened, right? I can write the facts of it. Like, I could write, that my mother had my father put a padlock on the refrigerator, or I could write about her giving me enemas when I'm a young teenager. I can write these things factually, but that doesn't give the reader any sense of what it felt like. So why is that so difficult for me? Well, it's difficult for me because I've worked, and this is where the trauma comes in. I have worked, or my brain has worked very hard to suppress what that felt like. And that suppression, that's, I believe, one of the reasons why, one of the chief reasons why I became an addict, um, is, the addiction provides an escape. That's one of the things that it does. So, yeah, I mean, I've always struggled with this idea of, okay, I can tell you the truth, but it comes off very flat and lifeless. Like, that can't convey what it was like. So even though it supposedly breaks one of the great tenets, if you will, of memoir, I admire your courage to do that, to try and get at what it felt like.
Exactly. And a lot of the time, I'm not there. So with your dad's padlock, well, what was that like when he was putting it on? What was the conversation to your mom? Now, so some of the times I will take liberties. I'll tell the reader, this is what I think might have been happening. But I mean, part of it, of the drama of it is like, what are they thinking? You know, and so
Yeah.
with my trauma, trying to create that drawer in the house that we pulled out as a second safety in the bathroom, that is real. Okay. Those stairs, they're real. The medicine, that's real. So a lot of that's real. Did my dad knock my mom out onto the carpet? Not real. But then I find out later he punched her in the stomach when she was pregnant with me. And my sister tells me that he clearly punched her many times. I wasn't always there, or I wasn't there most of the time. But I know it happened. So how can I tell that? I wasn't there. So it's like there's all this drama that is
Yes.
excluded, and it just seems like it's an injustice to the little boy who lived through that
Yes.
trauma to make fact what I saw in my limited ability to bring that out to the world.
Yeah, and this is something that I actually in my MFA program we had to give a lecture at the end of our program, and I lectured so on the American writer Tim O'Brien um, has he has an actual memoir. His first book was a memoir, "If I Die in a Combat Zone," about his actual experiences both prior to being sent to Vietnam, like in basic training and advanced infantry training, and then in Vietnam. And I read it, but I read it after I read the book he's generally most famous for, which is The Things They Carried, which was published in 1989. And The Things They Carried, if you haven't read, for people who haven't read it, reads like a memoir. I mean, it's written from the perspective of Tim O'Brien, a character named Tim O'Brien, who has many of the characteristics of the real Tim O'Brien. And but it's fictional,
Right.
and
I mean,
it,
I think that's appropriate because Vietnam War is highly traumatic, and I read both those books, and the things they carry brings out the trauma so much more clearly than If I Die in a Combat Zone, at least the way I read it.
yes. Yeah, and I had the same reaction too. Like, If I Die in a Combat Zone is almost like reporting. I mean, it's not badly written at all, but it does not capture the insanity of war, the insanity of the experience, the trauma of the experience. And so it's interesting that and so many people, when they first read The Things They Carried, if they're not aware that it is actual fiction, often believe it's true. So much so that Tim O'Brien writes about that experience within the book, or the character of Tim O'Brien writes about the experience of people always asking, "Is it true? Is it true?" And his answer to that is he has the concept of story truth versus happening truth. So happening truth is what actually happened. Story truth is the emotional truth of that experience. So most memoir tries to combine the two. But as you pointed out with with what you told us about the Shining experience, is that happening truth is, if you try to stay within what you know, it can actually handcuff you. It can limit healing, which I agree. I mean, I think fundamentally I write for myself too. I don't write for an audience. I write to try and understand myself better.
Michael, can I
And
interject on the healing part?
absolutely, yeah, go ahead.
The end of that story where I jump out the window. I mean, what? Well, that's not totally unrealistic. We could jump out our second story window onto the embankment, and we did. But the idea of doing that, like a quick motion through the screen, and so that it was when I wrote that, it was the most cathartic experience, probably of the whole book, of feeling like, hell, this boy had power. Woo!
Had
Versus,
agency,
yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
What
Versus being a victim, the victim who couldn't do anything.
and I really like that idea, because I feel like in my own writing, again, I can write about the victimization. I can write, and I'm getting better at writing what it felt like, but to then use narrative, to use story to heal by writing a way out for that little boy, that 12-year-old boy, a way for him to escape in a way that in reality he never did.
Right. And to
Um,
be, my concern was to be fair to the reader, I don't want to be deceptive. So in the
yes,
book, I have to the reader, and I say both that last part is completely not true, and the rest of them is more of an amalgamation of different things that did happen. So I just don't
yeah,
want, it's not, I don't want to be dishonest to the reader. I think that's where I'm stepping over the line and violating trust with
yeah,
the reader.
yes, I agree, and I think that fundamentally, I mean, what I've come to understand about creative nonfiction. So the creative nonfiction is not fact, not an objective truth. Why? Because there really is no such thing as an objective truth. Everyone has a different perspective. Like you said, your brother has a different perspective. Your sister has a different perspective. Your mother, when she was here, had a different perspective. So the idea that there is a single objective truth is just fundamentally wrong. There isn't. There is
Right. And
only yeah, go ahead.
I want to add something on that because it's reminding me before we go past this part. Um, okay, the part where my dad chases me up and attacks me, breaks into the bathroom. Okay, and I've told you this before, but that was again that did not happen. That's part of my creative nonfiction, but I found out just before I published this book, and I added it to the later in the book, that my brother did exactly that. Broke through the door with his fist after my sister. So
Mm.
so here you are like, oh, I didn't see it. Don't put it in the book. But then that was happening in my house, and maybe I was there. I blacked it out. But that the lunatics were not just my dad. My brother did that to my sister, and she fainted when he broke in, and then closed that drawer so you could actually open the door. Broke through the door, and
Wow.
so wow, that actually really did happen in that house. And when I wrote it, no.
Yeah. But you see that's a great example of what I was talking about. Like, that even what we think of as, and that's kind of the second point. So the first point was there is no objective truth. The second point is what we think is the truth. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Like, you know, for for you, I felt like reading your book and reading particularly that that section, the Shining experience, was it really, and I love the fact that you put it at the beginning because it really gives a sense of what it felt like, and what it felt like is the truth to you.
Right. And we'll call it boundary crossing with violence. The idea that my father would cross a boundary like breaking into a door or hitting my mom. I want to make that so clear because, many, many years later, when I asked him if he had made amends to the people he's beat up, he said, well, I couldn't meet him. I didn't see him, but he did look at me in a sad way because he was sober for years. And he said, and I don't think I killed anybody. But this ability, this lethal person with little kids in the house, his ability to cross over into family murder, it was real, but I can't convey that. I want to convey that he'll punching somebody for him,
Yeah.
that is nothing. Easily to do that.
Yeah, and I feel like, I mean, that's really what I want to stress is that it's not about deception. This is not, and I'm glad that you made that point because it is not about deception. And the same thing with the things they carried, it's right on the spine. It's a work of fiction. So it's not about actually trying to deceive people. And certainly creative nonfiction has had cases like that. Like I remember, there was a big, I think James Frey's book, A Million Little Pieces. Oprah took him to task for doing this kind of thing. So I often think that there's an expectation for the lay reader that this has to be the absolute truth. And that's not creative nonfiction. Creative
Yeah,
nonfiction
and what
does, yeah.
I could do is just do what Tim O'Brien did, is call this book a work of fiction. And it actually might be nice because I'm separating myself from some of the stuff in that book, which is not all always, peaches and cream in terms of I don't look great. He doesn't look great.
Yeah.
So the idea of, so maybe on some level, it's an act of cowardice. I detach myself from the actual thing because I wouldn't want anybody to think anything except for I live in a normal family and I'm a normal person. So, I mean, I
Well,
don't know. I
I
could
don't
do that.
actually. I think another perspective is that it is a way of being able to tell a very difficult story. Because, and I think we'll kind of close with a discussion of this, that trauma. I don't know that there's. It's a word that gets bandied around a lot, and let's maybe talk about what it is. There's simple trauma, right? And then there's complex trauma. You want to talk about kind of the difference between those two?
Sure. I mean, the the concept of PTSD comes in to that, and this idea of, to me, I think, I don't know if you call it simple trauma, but the idea that you're having flashbacks that are real. So you hear a car backfire if you were a Vietnam vet, and then you're freaking out right there, literally freaking out about the car backing. Whereas mine was more of what it falls under the definition of complex PTSD or trauma, which is I'm not freaking out specifically about things and remembering it in my dreams and
Mm-hmm.
going crazy. It's just the way I view the world is
Yeah,
tainted. So it's like no like visceral memories or dreams, but more like well, learning to be very detached from the world because
yeah,
I'm traumatized. It's too dangerous to feel. So a lot of that has to do with complex PTSD around trauma. Is, to me, it's not having such visceral reactions, but never, and so therefore people can ignore it like it's nothing,
yes.
but still suffering the effects of it.
Yeah, it's like, if, God forbid you're in a car accident, you're in a plane crash or whatever, not to minimize that is a traumatic event, but it's a single event. Now there's ongoing trauma related to that, but like complex trauma is something, and it's usually not nearly as over the top as a car crash or a plane crash, but it's something that goes on and on. It happens over and over and over again. And that's also something that you touched upon in the Shining experience, is that this was, yes, it was an amalgamation, but it was about trying to capture what it felt like on an ongoing basis. I mean, what does it feel like to live in fear of a parent?
Right. And that's what I was trying to convey. Whereas 911, again, horrific. 3,000 people die. It's terrible, horrible. But for most of America, in the book I mentioned we spent $6 trillion reacting to that in wars, right? Whereas the trauma of a family like that, actually, it's a secret and nobody cares, and it happens for 4 years on and off. And so, yeah, it's a different type of experience, definitely.
Yeah. And so we are out of time. I do, and we wanted to talk about the impact of trauma on memory. And so we'll save that for a second episode. Also, we're going to be talking about um let's see, how would you call it? I don't want to use the term political violence, but like the ways in which I don't know. You described it better, I think, Jim.
Well, no, just the ways in which my father was a very conservative man. So the way in which conservative culture, but we're also going to do this with you with maybe liberal culture, but the way in
Yeah.
which conservative culture can hide, protect, justify the type of abuse that I endured in my dad's family, patriarchy. Therefore, doing this is actually not a big deal because, well, he is God. Abraham was supposed to sacrifice his own son. So the idea that he's harming us, whatever, he's making the decision. It's his. Leave him alone. This kind of thinking.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, like with my mother was abusive, but from more of a liberal justification. Like, you could almost, like, in principle, like, I could agree with some of her decisions, but not to the degree that she took them.
Right. So I think there'll be a lot of room for further episodes around those topics. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you for joining us on Rising Above Trauma, Addiction, and Culture in a Crazy World for our first episode, Truth and Trauma. Look for our next episode in the coming in 2 weeks. And remember, the worst effects of trauma and addiction can be overcome. And that's actually another topic that we're going to talk about, whether or not one can fully overcome trauma. I look forward to that discussion too. And recovery starts with a simple, honest conversation. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.